introducing a book project which I've lived with for far too long, but still find myself struggling with the conceptual framework. So I'm going to try to introduce that to you today and also contextualise my project, because I'm assuming that a lot of the subject matter, the content, will be unfamiliar, even if the methodology isn't. So I'm looking at the work of three prominent German writers of Turkish origin as minor literature in the Deleuzean sense. And my aim in the book is to show how a Deleuzean approach to literature enables us to appreciate texts by minority writers in ways that do not reduce them to notions of ethnic origin or even to a structure of margins and mainstream, but makes a claim for their importance in the transformation of German culture. 2011 marked 50 years since Turkish labour migration to the Federal Republic began. And during those 50 years, Germany has only latterly and gradually come to acknowledge its status as a country of immigration. But the years since German unification in 1990 have seen, if anything, increased tensions in its relationship with its largest minority. Roughly 8.3% of the population in Germany is of foreign origin, and 25% of that, those are of Turkish origin. And in the current climate of fear and suspicion of others within, I'm particularly concerned with Deleuze's understanding of literature's connection to a political immediacy beyond the text. I'm not the first to invoke Deleuze and minor literature in relation to Turkish-German culture, but often when this is done, it's in ways that fail to do justice either to the writing or to Deleuzean thought, I think. My project seeks, first of all, to draw attention to the diversity and the quality of these writers' work, and to undertake the first consistently Deleuzean reading of minority literature in German. A major study does exist of Prague German and Sudeten German literature, published in 2005 by Christian Jäger of the Humboldt University in Berlin, where he is inspired by Deleuze's Kafka toward a minor literature. But so far there's no really major study of Turkish-German writing from this perspective. So to do this, I want to go beyond representational reading techniques and to advocate an ethical reading strategy which is not bent on interpretation as much as what Marco Abel calls a response-able encounter with the other in literature. Rather than looking for realism and the authentic expression of ethnic identities, I attempt to draw attention to the affective qualities of the texts, difficult though it is to discuss these other than in terms of representation. So, in invoking unimagined communities, my interest is precisely in the text's refusal to represent minority communities in any predictable or even recognisable ways. So these are pictures of the authors, and the names of the authors, more importantly. Emine Sevgi Özdemir was born in 1946 in Malatya in Turkey and grew up in Turkey, coming to Germany only as a worker in the 1960s. However, she is a theatre director and writer and actress in her own right. So she's lived in Germany since the late 1970s. Zafer Şenocak was born in 1961 in Ankara and has lived in Germany since the age of about 7. So his whole education and most of his life has been spent in Germany. And Feridun Zaimoğlu was born in 1964 in Bolu in Turkey, but has also lived in Germany since he was about 10. So both Şenocak and Zaimoğlu have been entirely educated in Germany. So my structure. I'm going to say a little bit about the marginal status of Turkish-German literature in the German literary scene. And I'm going to talk then, say very briefly something about the approach generally taken by German Germanists when they do pay attention to minority writing and particularly Turkish-German literature, known as intercultural German studies. I'm then going to give a brief example of what I consider one of the misuses of Kafka toward a minor literature in writing on these far too briefly and sketchily, I'm afraid, a non-representational approach to literature, using Marco Abel's term, well, I think it wasn't his term originally, masocriticism. And then I'm going to talk, try to give examples, two short stories, one by Feridun Zaimoğlu, one by Zafer Şenocak, and just to try to exemplify the kind of readings that I'm aiming to do. So in my discussion of the two short stories, I'll attempt to show how they both render identification uneasy and interpretation problematic, due to a lack of an ambiguous moral framework. It's like the lack of an establishing shot in cinema. Both stories plunge us into the intensity of a situation, the outcome of which remains uncertain. Feridun Zaimoğlu's story, called Libido Economy, was first published in 2004, and Zafer Şenocak's The Saxophone Player in 2006. Both play humorously or laconically with ethnic identifications, but these are also bound up with and implicated in more intimately implicated in other themes, such as capitalist flows, masochistic desire, and political violence. In many of these texts, I find that intensities produced by these things are not categorized and not differentiated as discretely as one might expect. So, to move on, sorry about the blurry images, to the gatekeepers of German literature. Christian Jäger, whose book on Sudeten and Prague German literature I mentioned, has described the German literary culture as striated space, and indeed still very powerful forces police the boundaries of German literary culture. The book on the right, the cover on the right here, is a collection of essays published in 2004 based on a conference that was held in Istanbul in just presumably 2003 or so, and it was a conference of big names in German literary criticism, and it was entirely focused on minority writing, both from Turkey and from Eastern Europe, and Jewish writing, and just a whole range of minority writing, called the other German literature, which is in itself telling. And in this collection, Norbert Mecklenburg, who is a prominent critic and gatekeeper of contemporary German literature, dismissed both of the authors I'm going to be talking about today as just unimportant, to be soon forgotten, in quite a polemical essay. Özdemir, the female author I work on, is the only one that he admits whose work has literary value. So he warns against the positive evaluation of minority writing just because it suits our political agenda, as a form of political correctness. But he reinforces an unreflectingly traditional notion of literary value, literature in the realist mode that must stand the test of time, so actually we can't really know whether any contemporary writing is of value. And he upholds the need for a canon to protect against the collapse of literary culture and the corruption of the market. And that shows you just how also Germany retains not just a very exclusive view of literary culture, but also of high literary culture. The difference between popular culture and real literature with a capital L is still very kind of strictly maintained. But it's not just literary critics who are upholding these distinctions. Anxieties about the contamination or even disappearance of German culture are much more widespread, as recently voiced by Thilo Sarrazin, on the left there, in a book that was a bestseller in 2010 called Germany is Abolishing Itself, which is a polemic against immigration, basically. It's particularly against Muslim immigration. And Thilo Sarrazin was a social democrat politician, not a conservative, and a prominent employee of the Bundesbank, who famously lost his job with the Bundesbank due to some supposedly anti-Semitic comments that he made around the time that this book came out. But this book is very definitely more an anti-Islam polemic, and it's the fact that it was such a bestseller, and it was controversial, it was scandalous, but one suspects that it also says a lot of things that people were quite glad were being said. So Germany's relationship to its Turkish minority is a strained one. Within those very few Germanists who do take Turkish-German writing, minority writing seriously, they are found in a niche known as intercultural Germanistic, intercultural German studies. At this point I should point out that Deleuze is roundly dismissed in German Germanistic, most unanimously in Kafka scholarship. One of the key objections that they always bring up is that what Deleuze and Guattari describe as the sobriety of Kafka's style has been disproved by recent Kafka research, which sees the style of the first published editions of his works as largely down to Max Brodt's editorial intervention, and Kafka research now sees Kafka is now at recent editions of his work show him writing in a much more regional idiom than the first published editions of his works displayed. So there are kind of empirical objections, but I think there's much more fundamental methodological nationalism in play in the resistance to Deleuze and Guattari in German Germanistic. A commitment to dialectical thinking and to a hermeneutics rooted in the German philosophical tradition. And this is nowhere more evident than in the marginal subdiscipline of intercultural German studies, which originated in the teaching of German as a foreign language. So it was concerned with the transmission of German culture to foreign cultures, but now its focus is in the reception of foreignness in German culture. And according to one exponent, again a sort of eminence grise of German studies, Karl Esselborn, this involves an enlightened exchange of different perspectives, a self-aware engagement with the other or the foreigner, and a, quote, creative milieu of active tolerance, unquote. Germanists working in the US were the first to criticize intercultural German studies for its insistence on conceiving of difference always in terms of a self-other binary. Fundamentally, it takes Gadamer's approach to historical difference and transfers it onto cultural difference. So, just as we can only transcend the particularity of our vision because of the historical continuum which we inhabit. So there is a supposed cultural continuum, I suppose, that we inhabit. There is a certain universalism underpinning this this view of cultural difference, but which is always also articulated in terms of a dialogue between self and other. Azadeh Seyhan, who is as it happens, Turkish Germanist working in the States, criticised the appropriation of Gadamer's truth and method as follows. Although Gadamer maintains that the desire for understanding originates in the self's experience of its otherness, and understanding is always the interpretation of the other, the realization of historical understanding takes place in the fusion of familiarity and foreignness, and this fusion comes very close to consuming the foreign, so sort of rendering familiar the foreign. And what never seems to be questioned in intercultural German studies is whether the encounter with the foreign also has a transformative effect on the self. This is what doesn't seem to enter the picture. To move on to uses of Kafka toward a minor literature, this is the famous definition of minor literature from that text. The deterritorialization of language, the connection of the individual to a political immediacy, and the collective assemblage of enunciation being the three features that are always mentioned. And despite the disarming simplicity of Deleuze and Guattari's definition of minor literature in Kafka, An understanding of its terms involves an engagement with Deleuze's materialist ontology as a whole, and those who read only Deleuze and Guattari's book on Kafka to extract from it a theory of literature tends to end up producing little more than common-sense platitudes about literature's political import in giving a voice to minority subjects. And here it's important, of course, at first to differentiate between minority and minor, while also to explain why my focus is on minority writers. The link is not self-evident. As Deleuze and Guattari state in A Thousand Plateaus, minorities, of course, are objectively definable states of language, ethnicity, or sex with their own ghetto territorialities. But they must also be thought of as seeds, crystals of becoming, whose value is to trigger uncontrollable movements and deterritorializations of the mean or majority. This potential to trigger radical change is by no means necessarily actualized, as they also emphasize when distinguishing between the majoritarian as a constant and homogeneous system, minorities as subsystems, and the minoritarian as a potential creative and created becoming. If this minoritarian potential is to be actualized in any literature, literature also has to be approached in new ways, not as the expression of a collective identity, nor the representation of a collective in either the aesthetic or the political sense. And yet this is precisely how minority writing usually is interpreted. And to give an idea, or give an example of this this use of Deleuze and Guattari in German studies, I want to give an example of an essay written by the translator of this novel, the first novel of Emine Sevgi Özdemir, called Life is a Caravanserai, has two doors. I came in one, I went out the other, which has been brilliantly translated by the Canadian translator Louisa von Flotow. But she then published an article on the translation that drew heavily on an albeit second-hand Deleuzean understanding of minor translation. This novel is the semi-autobiographical account of childhood in 1950s and 60s Turkey. It was controversially awarded a prestigious literary prize in 1991, which assured Özdemir's arrival on the literary scene, albeit a controversial one. Some critics were appalled by this affront to German literature, and others delighted by the poetic effect of German inflected by the Turkish language in the novel. Von Flotow addresses each aspect of Deleuze and Guattari's definition, beginning by describing the novel as a collective assemblage of enunciation, by which she means an expression of a minority collectivity. She describes Özdemir's language as a half-language that the meeting of Turkish and German has brought forth. And she goes on, there is a clear political immediacy in writing in broken German and thereby representing a minority or migrant population. First of all, I would object to the broken German. It's idiosyncratic, but it's not exactly broken. And also this assumption that thereby she represents this minority population. She goes on by writing in Turkish-German. In Turkish-German, she represents the minority group, but by setting her work in the country of origin, she moves this group into a majority position. Finally, she defines the term deterritorialization with respect to Özdemir's literal translations from Turkish into German. Quote, by taking concepts, names, expressions, and syntactic structures from the minority language Turkish and translating them literally into German, she systematically deterritorializes German, producing a German that is understandable but not grounded in German culture. It has been moved out of its territory, unquote. Now, I agree with Flotow that this is an extraordinary novel, and I enormously admire the translation she's produced. But its importance goes far beyond literal translations from Turkish and a resulting estrangement of the German language. As I've argued elsewhere, the novel's power is not located in its orientally tinted German, which is one critic's praise, nor in its enlightenment of German readers about foreign Turkish traditions, but in its utter strangeness, its grotesque and disorientating features, from the lack of punctuation in the long title to the relentless 300-page flow of prose without chapter breaks. It plunges us into an animated life world where nothing is stable, everything subject to sudden mutation and unexpected change. It's also an intensely pleasurable flow of language once one abandons the attempt to extract from it from its contents, ethnographic information, psychological or social realism. So if this writing is to be deemed minor in Deleuze and Guattari's sense, we must think more rigorously about the implications of their terminology. Firstly, these Turkish-German writers are intellectuals. They're not representative voices speaking for a minority population of settled migrant labourers. It may well be that the conversion of their ethnicity, contemporary debates about the failure of multiculturalism in Germany, and the German language in which they write, places their works in a particular semiotic regime of power, but I think that's something different. As Lawrence Venuti points out, the collective assemblage of an enunciation is linked to a particular view of language in Deleuze and Guattari's writing. To quote Venuti, "It's never simply an instrument of self-expression or communication, but a collective force, an assemblage of forms that make up a semiotic regime. These forms serve expressive or communicative functions, but they are imperative as well, embodying social orders and obligations and carrying different quanta of power," unquote. So, as Venuti goes on, a text of minor literature does not just express an intended meaning in a personal style. Quote, "It rather puts to work forms that are tradition-bearing, socially affiliated, depersonalized by the cultural hierarchy in which they are situated. Minor language use evokes the history of its domination." So, Oestermar's prose, as I discuss in other parts of the book, evokes features of an oral literary tradition and Brechtian theatre, inserted into the Turkish Republic of the 1950s or Cold War Berlin. Zaimoğlu's prose frequently confronts the post-Cold War European present with German Romanticism and mysticism. Theirs is a more complex relationship to the German language and culture than a mere geographical relocation. Similarly, political immediacy must be thought of other than in terms of juridically defined identities, or even just in terms of expanding the majority, the citizenry. And this is almost always how Turkish-German literature is contextualized. It's contextualized against recent changes in the citizenship legislation of Germany, which has radically changed since 2000. The traditional understanding of citizenship as being based on ethnicity and ancestry was replaced really momentously in 2000 by a law which introduces a right to not just German citizenship but dual citizenship to children born in Germany of non-German parents. Only children are accorded dual citizenship, but still the right to citizenship to just by virtue of having been born there is a very new departure in the understanding of citizenship. However, it's as if that explained anything, and I think political immediacy has to be thought in terms other than simply this kind of expansion, quantitative expansion of the majority of the citizenry. But rather, we need to think in terms of a qualitative transformation of the majoritarian standard by minoritarian practices. Paul Patton has tried to envisage what this might mean in practice, arguing that, quote, "processes of minoritarian becoming will always exceed or escape from the confines of any given majority. They carry the potential to transform the effects, beliefs, and political sensibilities of a population in ways that amount to the advent of a new people," unquote. The reference to affects and sensibilities here, I think, extends the idea of the political into the aesthetic and makes the crucial connection between minor literature and unimagined communities, or as Deleuze and Guattari call them, the people to come. Similar to Jean-Luc Nancy's non-substantive notion of inoperative community, this is an idea of community in the moment of its productive potential, before identities and power structures rein it in. And I was interested to read recently, because I've only recently looked at Bertolt Schroner's book on the cosmopolitan novel, that he also, as I have, gives the example of the fall of the Berlin Wall in these terms. He says, "The kind of communal spirit that brought down the Berlin Wall but then wound up stifled as the expediencies of traditional nation building resumed their highly predictable course." And indeed, my claim for the power of minor fabulation in Turkish-German literature bears comparison with Schöne's claims for the cosmopolitan novel in English, that breaks with foundational narratives and allows future narratives to emerge. Schöne sets out to trace the development of a new narrative modus operandi in British fiction, responding to contemporary global capitalism. A Deleuzean approach to literature combines that focus on capitalist flows with a departure from the representational paradigm. It requires engagement with Deleuze's materialism, whereby the forces present in literature also pervade its material context. As Marco Abel points out, this was already anticipated by post-structuralism. Quoting Abel, one of the more crucial lessons offered to us by post-structuralism is that the context is never really outside the text, precisely because context and text are part of the same network of forces, or to use Deleuze and Guattari's key concept, plane of immanence. Unquote. Deleuze and Guattari emphasise this imbrication of individual stories and social milieu in Kafka's work. And quoting from Toward a Minor Literature, the individual concern becomes all the more necessary, indispensable, magnified, because a whole other story is vibrating within it. In this way, the family triangle connects to other triangles, commercial, economic, bureaucratic, juridical, that determine its values. In the stories of Zaimoğlu and Şenocak, I hope to show, in a minute, that the minute, close-up detail of their characters' lives resonates with the forces present in their milieu, which serves as much more than a mere backdrop to individual action. And then I want to sketch very briefly an approach to non-representational reading, which I think is at the heart of Deleuze's philosophical project, and offers perhaps the greatest challenge to the literary critic, for whom the search for meaning seems to be so paramount. The attempt to push philosophy beyond a propositional mode of thought in Deleuze's work, to enable encounters that escape recognition and to liberate thought from the images that imprison it, is equally unsettling for the way literary criticism is practiced. In place of reading for psychological realism, immersion in a fictional world, and identification with characters, we need to be attentive to pre-subjective affective forces in the text. Marco Abel calls this the primacy of the affective response solicited by the novel's design, rather than realism or a shared sense of authenticity. This is especially significant for the reception of minority writers who tend to be read for authentic expression of ethnic identities and ignored if they don't deliver them. And even if we end up, as we always do, talking about meaning and representation, we need to recognise this for what it is, a re-territorialisation of the affect released by the text onto familiar landscapes of ethnicities, identities and behaviours. The challenge is to prolong the stage that precedes that moment of interpretation, to be aware of our embodied reading experience as an encounter with forces that impinge upon us before we organise and make sense of them. For Marco Abel, this is the beginning of an ethical approach to literature, in that what we are is preceded and conditioned by the otherness of forces external to us. This is what he terms masocriticism for its structural similarity to the masochistic contract. We subject ourselves to a pre-existent external force before imposing our judgment upon it. Affect as pre-subjective force comes first, both ontologically and pragmatically. Abel points out that we always respond on an affective level before interpreting what we've read, so it's rather a case of asking what the text does with its affective force. Does it invite a recognition response, or does it attempt to defer one, seeking to actualise the reader's response ability? At the same time, it's never a binary opposition, affect versus cognition. The two are always co-present. Writing that defers the immediate territorialisation of affect onto representationalism does not escape from representation altogether. It merely shows that the affective quality of the writing isn't reducible to its meaning. To quote Abel again, to insist on the reality of representation, its affective quality, against the idea that signalétic materials are representations of reality, is not to suggest that our access to the reality of representation is immediate. It is to suggest, however, that such access is not reducible to such an image's meaning, but instead has to account for what reality does. In the discussion of the short stories that follows, I shall attempt to show how they resist a reterritorialization of affect onto recognizable ethnic identities, even if they bring such identities into play in various ways. So, this is my first example. And it's a story called Libido Economy, or Libido Economy, from 2004. The prose fiction of Feridun, Zaimoğlu and Zafer Şenocak is not entirely abstract, nor even exceptionally poetic, although Şenocak is also a considerable poet. But both have a way of dealing with realism that unsettles it at the same time. Just as Francis Bacon did not altogether renounce figurative art, but disturbed it with moments of violent distortion, these writers do construct distinct characters in often recognisable locations, but not in ways that offer easy identification or presuppose an unambiguous moral stance. Zaimoğlu shot to fame in 1995 with a collection of hip-hop-inspired monologues called Kanaksprek, adapted from interviews with young urban Turkish-German men living mainly on the edges of legality. While these young men's street slang is actually characterised by much code switching between Turkish and German, Zaimoğlu's text Germanizes their speech. He removes the actual Turkish from it and displays an incredible virtuosity with different dialects, specialist language use and poetic effects. And arguably this mobilization of the diverse linguistic resources of German itself, as much as the superimposition of Turkish on German, as Özdemir practices, is what Deleuze and Guattari meant by becoming a foreigner in one's own language. Zaimoğlu's more recent work is very diverse in genre and theme, often drawing inspiration from the German literary canon, and increasingly challenging secular left-liberal German cosmopolitanism with an uncompromising focus on religion. I'm also interested in how the self-ironic humour of much of his writing undermines the representative gesture also present in his texts. His collection of stories, 12 Grams of Happiness, in 2004, ostensibly all concerned with young men's pursuit of heterosexual love, are divided into one section called Diesseits, This World, set in German cities, and a section called Jenseits, The Beyond or the Afterlife, set in either small towns or unlocatable settings in Turkey. The binary structure seems to be set up for deconstruction, however, as themes of love, sex, religion, and politics permeate all the stories. One critic has pointed to the fine balance struck in the stories between the personal and the political, whereas I see the two as wholly continuous. Particularly the story Libido Economy plays on the language of exchange and irrepressible flows with relation to both sex and capitalism. Ethnic clichés do occur, but in such a humorous way they cannot be taken too seriously. They are in any case subordinate to the story's focus on capitalism. The narrator is, we assume, ethnically German, and describes himself as a recession rogue who deals in used and discounted goods in a small bookshop. He sells on for ludicrous prices the old stock that commercial booksellers can't shift, or that are simply stolen by his contacts. He himself comments that his brand of procurement would once have counted as criminal, but that since theft has become so commonplace, he no longer even feels self-conscious about it. And this, I think, is a particularly prescient quote for a text written presumably before 2004. For some years now, this is what's been happening. The little people's saved or invested capital is cashed in by the banks and the state. This is what you call the destruction of wealth, pure and simple. But my will to wealth creation is unbroken. So I slip into the periphery of the capital flow and convert whatever seems superfluous into money. This narrator describes himself as always on the move, ducking and diving from one shady deal to the next, keeping out of the way of the police to protect his contacts, whom he provocatively calls my unofficial collaborators, using precisely the same term used for those who informed for the East German Stasi. The only depiction of Turks in the story occurs at the town refuse tip, where the narrator hands over a broken TV set to an eccentric array of cliché Turks conducting their own alternative economy, taking broken electrical goods and offering a range of services from hairdressing to pain-free circumcision. Their own mastery of their ethnic identity is a bit shaky. One says to him, "I'm called Ali, like Ali Baba and the 40 Gangsters," and another slaps the narrator on the shoulder and reminds him that they were brothers in arms in the Second World War rather than the First, so no real sense of authenticity is produced. A German stereotype is also found in the humorless, pedantic Heidi who works in an organic grocery and with whom the narrator likes to pick arguments. But the point of this encounter is rather that he notices in passing how much the bananas cost. Exoticism is for sale, can be sold. The adjective used therefore for sale in German is also has connotations of prostitution. And indeed, the narrator later reflects on the cost of an afternoon with an East European prostitute in terms of four bunches of bananas. Prostitution is just another current in the capital flows through the town. He calls the town, I quote, the first sluice gate for girls from the Eastern Bloc. Where the cheap articles get stuck, the main current follows the course of the money. There are few arrests, the bosses keep their jobs, the distribution network functions very well. Unquote. Vera, the prostitute to whom he goes, is one such stranded piece of flotsam whom he visits from time to time, whether despite or because of her violent sadomasochistic fantasies about sex with a blonde Nazi, a role the narrator is sometimes required to perform. So he doesn't shy away from cliches. The woman's sadomasochistic fantasy, in which she is entirely in control of her male client, echoes another narrative strand which frames the whole story, because the narrator's days are punctuated by encounters with an anonymous woman who phones him for telephone sex. The woman, called alternately the telephone terrorist and the telephone erotomaniac, calls him precisely every 12 hours, phone calls around which his whole daily routine is structured. Their conversations range from relationships to art history, and he feels he has to have topics prepared to keep the conversation going, while she determines when the topic changes. As she herself says to him, "You certainly are a strange guy. An unknown woman has been phoning you mornings and evenings for 2 weeks now. She doesn't promise you anything, you don't get anything from her, and you go along with it and don't protect yourself against it. In your place, I would have called the police long ago." And this is an apt description of one who is alternately a flirting, wheeler-dealing man about town and a patient, compliant partner in a quasi-masochistic contract. At one point he accuses her of merely using him to manage her own libido, but in fact he is completely enthralled to her, and at the end of the story we realise that she's already present in the opening lines. So far my discussion of the narrative has done just what I set out not to do, to interpret it in terms of a central character's interactions with his environment in linear sequence of events. To convey the affective quality of the text without this level of interpretation is extraordinarily difficult, especially when translating from German. But the identity of the narrator emerges only gradually through his encounters, our restriction to his worldview inviting no moral judgment. The story begins actually not with him at all, but with a quite inexplicable, haunting scene, the explanation of which is tantalizingly deferred. The first word of the story is lapis lazuli, the intense blue of a gemstone, referring to the fleeting glimpse of a woman's eyes as she dances, half concealed by marble pillars, the beads on her belt leaping to the rhythm of her gyrating body. This vision is a, quote, Eurasian Venus trap, evoking a sexual allure that is at once exotic and deeply ambiguous. The blue of her eyes and the alluring dance conjure an image that remains unexplained until the very end of the story, when it turns out that it is performed by the telephone terrorist herself, glimpsed by the narrator on the dance floor of a club. The Eurasian tribal dance that she performs is performed by a blue-eyed woman called Nora without any discernible Oriental origin. Its surprise effect is further enhanced by the cynicism and self-irony of the narrator's thoughts up until then, and by her previous complaints about the oppressive ubiquity of the male gaze. She has, after all, withdrawn herself from his gaze until now. And the reader is just left to ponder the apparent contradictions of this improbable romantic encounter. But such contradictions are less problematic if one views identities in the text not as stable, unchanging entities, but as the temporary products of forces in flux, permeable to the forces of their milieu. The male lovers of Zaimoğlu's stories are hardly agents of their own fate, but are rather produced by and carried along on the forces that surround them. In this story, erotic and commercial flows. Instead of mere passivity, however, there is a consistency in their masochistic and often fetishistic relations with women. It's tempting to see this masochism in Deleuzean terms, where, as Ronald Bogue puts it, disavowal, suspense, waiting, fetishism, and the fantasy form the properly masochistic constellation. If there is no ultimate escape from the all-encompassing machine of capitalism, there is perhaps the contract that suspends this reality by means of an agreed ritual. For Deleuze, the masochist's fantasy disavows the real and envisions other possibilities for life. Again quoting Bogue, Sade and Masoch disclose a double of the world, one that perhaps may be deemed a sickness, but one also that ironically or humorously disrupts the real and clears the way for something new. So here I'm thinking not just about masochism as theme, but as a force at work both inside and outside the texts, inviting a response while deferring judgment on that which is represented, whether in terms of perversion, criminality, or exoticism. The second text I'm going to talk about very briefly is Zafer Şenocak's The Saxophone Player. Explicit and transgressive eroticism is also a prominent feature of Şenocak's work, in the 1990s particularly, but the story I'm going to talk about is more centrally concerned with political violence. Şenocak, like Zaimoğlu, has lived in Germany since he was a child and published his first poetry collections in the 1980s. A series of fragmentary prose works followed in the 90s, as well as several collections of political essays. Since 2009, he's been publishing novels in Turkish, which are now being translated into German. His style is very close, actually, to the sobriety which attributed by Deleuze and Guattari to Kafka. Very sparse plots, understated tone, fleeting glimpses of characters rather than psychological realism. And the story, The Saxophone Player, is set in post-9/11 New York and deals directly with the all-pervasive threat of terrorism from the perspective of one whose ethnic background places him in an ambiguous relationship to it. And what I find particularly interesting in this claustrophobic tale is the lack of any moralising stance. As with Zaimoğlu's stories, we have only the close-up perspective of the character's thoughts. There is no obvious or unambiguous moral framework within which to interpret the story's potentially violent events, allowing us to suspend judgment and dwell on our affective response. The first-person narrator is a failed writer and a moderately successful jazz musician in New York bars. His professional engagements and commuting to work on the subway occupy most of his solitary, semi-nocturnal existence. One night he overhears fragments of a conversation in the dark hallway of his apartment building, leading him to suspect that a terrorist attack on New York is being planned in the very ground floor restaurant of his building. Much of the narrative is then about his indecision as to what to do with this knowledge and his imaginative experimentation with different selves. At the start of the story, he longs for escape from the monotony of his life in the supposedly vibrant city of New York, but he experiences New York as a cramped, repetitive, machine-like existence. The city's rhythms and noise penetrate the lives of the humans within it. Their interiority is described as fragile and exposed to the forces of the milieu. And just a brief quote from the beginning of the story: "Perhaps it isn't the people who are the source of the city's pulse, but the rhythmic movements of the machines, the circulation of the traffic, the skeleton key of the sleep thieves, which opens up the most intimate spaces to everyone at every conceivable moment." In counterpoint to the machinic rhythms of the city, a morbid smell in the subway recalls that the no longer fatal AIDS virus is still circulating and in the incurable health of the people he encounters every day. The fact that the healthy and the infected are no longer distinguishable is later echoed in the narrator's unsettling reflection that the same is true of the terrorist and the non-terrorist. The story suspends exclusive, disjunctive categories of identity that would territorialise the terrorist threat as criminal. And to explain how it does so, I have to say something about the narrator's ethnicity and his relation to the apartment building in which he lives. There's been a bar or a restaurant in the building since times of Prohibition, a location associated with the flow of illegal alcohol, transient proprietors, and shifting ethnic cuisines. The narrator's encounter with its current Afghan proprietor occasions the first mention of his own background. When asked where he is from, the narrator says Seattle, and that his parents had immigrated from Russia, which is a lie. Markers of ethnic difference, however, seem meaningless, as he reflects that the Afghan could be taken for an Indian, and no one had noticed that the owner of the previously Indian restaurant there had been Taiwanese. The narrator himself vehemently denies being a Muslim, although he privately thinks back to his parents' earlier life in Tehran at the time of the Shah. And he thinks to himself, I was proud of not having given myself away as a Persian, as a Muslim, as anything else. I'm not any of those things anyway. I'm a saxophone player who's never been to Persia in his life, not even in Europe. The fragments of conversation he overhears in the dark hallway one sultry August night are in Persian dialect, which he fragmentarily understands, and his first thought is that he should inform the police. But he immediately thinks differently. The threat of annihilation becomes a moment of creative inspiration to write. The terrorist threat is transformed into a compound of sensations, a sudden unexpected intensity, with himself as witness, possible victim, even undercover informer, his Iranian background providing the perfect disguise. I, as a Muslim, as one of them. He thinks, I too, full of hatred for white America. So he imagines his own complicity, while also questioning its underlying assumptions. All the time he's not concerned with events as they unfold, but with his own experimental narrative of them. He's no longer afraid for his own safety, although he is afraid for his safety as he thinks of travelling on the underground, on the subway every day, and what if a bomb goes off in the subway. But he's intrigued as to where the story will take him, its denouement promising escape from the limited life he leads. But even this plan is fraught with uncertainty, above all with the instability of identity. He thinks to himself, but in our days nothing is predictable anymore, not even the terrorists are predictable. They behave as if they were one of us. In fact, he also says they don't even have the Mao Bible in their pockets anymore, but just the Bible. So the reference to terrorists having a Bible in their pocket may seem a provocative response to the frequent conflation of terrorism with Islam. But the narrator goes on to pronounce his conviction that all religion is a sexual perversion with undeniably erotic, probably homoerotic appeal, with the day of judgment promising untold sadomasochistic delights. He differentiates between Islamic mysticism's imagining of God as the unattainable beloved and the new fundamentalisms for which God is the dominatrix, the commanding, vengeful power that once in a while dispenses caresses. So religious faith here has connotations of sexual abandon and self-surrender, and the narrator also reflects on the meaning of the word Islam, which is, in German, Hingabe, a giving over of oneself, the voluntary submission to God. He thinks that's what Muslims call their religion, thereby revealing the erotic component of their faith. So instead of condemning religion, even of that of the supposed terrorists, he fantasizes himself as a sympathetic witness, a penitent sinner seeking salvation. As a second-generation American of Iranian descent, he views the suspected terrorist plot from the unsettling perspective of one who's both a potential victim and a potential accomplice. He's potentially one of them by virtue of his origins, but fantasizes himself becoming actually one of them by power of his imagination. In an anticlimactic ending, no terrorist attack happens, only an economic recession in which the Afghan restaurant goes out of business and employment is scarce. The closing lines of the story include a reflection on the immigrant's need for the power of imagination to liberate him from the weight of the past. And I'm really coming to the end now. Just a last quote from the very end of the story, where the narrator reflects, a foreigner, stranger, the same word in German, needs a lot of imagination in order to forget what he's left behind. He has to confront his memories with fantasy. I was also fantasizing in order to forget my origins, to shake off what separated me from my surroundings. But my fantasy has left me in the lurch again. So even if his life doesn't change, and indeed even if his fantasizing ended up reinserting him in an ethnic ghetto that he longs to escape, the role of fantasy as resistance to the present, as Deleuze and Guattari put it, seems paramount here. The story seems to me to endorse a view of literature's power not to represent a people rooted in memory and origins, but to invent what Deleuze and Guattari call a people to come. The moment of intensity produced by the threat of violence is one of creative possibility, with the potential to send life off on a new track before the forces of capitalism reinstate their inevitable regime. So what I'm working towards is an approach to these texts that attends to their historical contexts, but also to their potential to open up to a different future. So I'm attempting an exercise in ethical reading, which Abel defines as a matter of speed modulation, of slowing down the speed of judgment or representation. And ethical because it allows for the other, the text, the author, the character, to astonish and surprise me, rather than delivering what I already know. Thank you very much.